4-month trip, the captain had fallen in love with Mrs. Roosevelt's maid, and they ran off together. I promise you, this trip will not be as exciting, but we will do our best to make it enjoyable nonetheless. Just a few quick facts about the river. It is 2,200 feet across, down here at the base of Canal Street. The deepest part of the river, the Nadir, is 200 feet down, and that is off of Algiers Point, which is the bend in the river directly in front of us. We are 90 miles from the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Mississippi itself. The entire river is 2,320 miles long. It begins in Lake Itasca, Minnesota. And to answer your unspoken question, yes, it is still possible in today's day and age for 2 men and 2 dogs to travel the entire length of the Mississippi River in a single canoe. I had 2 very close friends do that in 2014. It took them 3 months to paddle the entire Mississippi. They described it as a hell of a lot of fun, but it smelled absolutely horrible, and then they didn't talk to each other for about 6 months. The Europeans discovered the Mississippi River in 1541. A man named Hernando de Soto came across it in Arkansas. He described the river as wide, muddy, and full of logs. It was discovered inland and not in the Gulf of Mexico because the Mississippi is not like the other major rivers of the world. It does not form a large natural harbor at the mouth. Instead, the water split up into multiple channels, which then split up into smaller channels, and the river primarily diffused into the Gulf of Mexico by way of bayou and swampland. So the mouth of the Mississippi River actually looked like swampland, which is to say, it looked like the rest of the Louisiana coastline. And if you didn't know what you were looking for, you weren't going to see it. For this reason, it was 177 years between the European discovery of the Mississippi River and the founding of a European colony on its shores. Not that they didn't try. In the 1680s, a man named De La Salle came all the way down the Mississippi from Canada. He got down here and he realized this would be a great spot for a colony. Then he turned around and he went back to Canada without going all the way down to the Gulf. He went all the way back to Canada, he crossed the Atlantic Ocean, he went to the King of France, he got funding ships and men, and then he sailed into the Gulf of Mexico, assuming he would find the mouth of the Mississippi River. I mean, how could you miss it? Look how big it is. He was wrong. De La Salle sailed right past the river without ever realizing it was here. He went all the way to what is now Texas, close to what is now Mexico, before giving up, starting a colony on those shores. That failed due to starvation, which led to mutiny. He was killed, his men walked back to Canada, and one survived. The world was a brutal place. And brutal places make brutal men. Enter Bienville and Iberville. 2 fearsome Frenchmen, they had a terrible reputation for attacking English settlements for profit. They were raiders. They got down here, they found the mouth of the Mississippi, and then they founded New Orleans. How did they do it? They asked directions. They spoke to the local tribes, who told them how to find the mouth of the river, but much, much more important, told them where to put their colony. They said if you put your colony right here, here being the French Quarter, it will never flood. And the French Quarter never really has. Not in 300 years, not even during Hurricane Katrina. Now the drainage is very poor, so if we have a torrential downpour, there will be a few inches of water in the streets, but once the rain stops, the water goes away. Had they not listened, had they put their colony just a few miles up or downriver, it would have been subject to periodic flooding. And that is why it is always a good idea to listen to the locals. Now Bienville and Iberville were very brave, to be sure. Unfortunately, they were not very creative. Before they founded New Orleans, they did some exploring and some naming. They went upriver to see what they could see, and what they saw was a large open area with a big red stick. They named this place Red Stick. Baton Rouge, that's what it means, that's where it comes from. Down in the Gulf of Mexico, they seem to name islands after whatever occurred to them at the moment. But I'll have to cover that in a moment. All right, folks, if you have a camera, you should take it out. If you have a phone with a camera, go ahead and pull that out. If you do not have a phone with a camera, then go to Best Buy because it's 2018. And then head to the port side of the boat because you're just about to have a perfect vacation photo opportunity. You can't quite see it yet, but it will be there. Off the port side of the boat, that is the Natchez, the other big paddle wheeler in the port of New Orleans. On the other side of the Natchez is the Jackson Brewery, where they used to make Jack's beer. next to the Jackson condos on the side of Jackson Square. Andrew Jackson is very big in New Orleans for reasons that will become evident today. And it is Jackson Square you're going to be taking a picture of, but not quite yet. The timing you are looking for is when the stairs on the outside of the levee cross the center of the cathedral. That will be the perfect moment to take the picture, and I will call that moment out. I am in the very front of the boat, so if you're in the rear, you will have to time it yourself. From the very front, it comes in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right there. There's your shot. It is actually one of the iconic pictures of New Orleans. They put it on the covers of books, magazines, pamphlets, advertisements, that sort of thing. If you did not get one of your own, do not worry. It is also on about 100,000 different postcards. Back to the names. Down in the Gulf of Mexico, they seem to name islands after whatever occurred to them at the moment. So, they dropped anchor, they left their ship at Ship Island. They lost a horn of powder on Horn Island. Deer Island is covered in deer, while Cat Island is covered in, anybody guess?
Cat.
Raccoons. They missed that one entirely. Raccoons are not native to Europe, and they did not know what they were looking at. There's a much more important historical name about 15 miles away from where we are now. In 1699, Bienville sat alone on the side of the Mississippi River. Upriver where we are, Iberville waits with all of their men, all 7 of them, a few muskets and some tents. Up the river sailed a massive British ship with 160 soldiers, colonists, livestock, cannons, muskets, gunpowder, anything and everything you would need to push 7 Frenchmen off the land. It's not a British colony instead of a French one. The future of New Orleans hung in the balance. The English captain saw Bienville on the side of the river and actually furled his sails, slowing down, and then called down to him. "Excuse me, sir, is this the Mississippi River?" Bienville looks up at the English captain and he says, "No, this is the Atchafalaya. You've missed it entirely. You need to go back down to the Gulf and keep going. But don't keep going up this river, because Iberville, you remember, terrible reputation as a raider, he has started a fort down here on these shores. He has cannons trained and sighted in on the water. He will destroy your ship to take your cargo. Save yourself, Mr. Englishman, do not keep going up this river." The English captain thanked him and turned around. And they named this place English Turn. It is still called that to this day. And that was the first time, which we will see later, not the last, that the British would be turned back from New Orleans by something of a deception and a lie. And before we go any farther downriver, and yes, folks, we are going downriver, I would just like to say to the British people that are riding the boat that I do love the British people. I had the privilege and the honor of studying at Oxford. I love the British people, British culture, British pubs, and British television. I think Doctor Who is amazing. But every good story needs a good villain, and Brits, you guys are it this time around. Sorry, but that's just the way it goes. So New Orleans was officially founded in 1718. The very first thing they had to do was to get people to come here. In order to make this a profitable colony, they needed colonists. In order to get those colonists, they turned to advertising. And in the glorious tradition of advertising, they simply lied. This is the approximate translation of the actual advertisement that went out across France. "Come, Frenchmen, to the mountains of New Orleans. Walk the sandy beaches of the Mississippi River, where you will pick up gold, silver, and pearls right off the ground. You'll bring in 2 crops a year, and you will never have to do a day's work, because the Indian loves the white man so much they will not allow him to work in the sun. There is no danger, there is no disease. Surely this is a paradise." Now surely every bit of that is BS, but some people actually did believe it. Germans. Not exactly sure why, but a large group of Germans believed the advertisement and came to New Orleans. When they got here, they did not stay. They kept on going upriver, presumably looking for those mountains. And they found them, sort of, starting a small colony in the foothills of the Ozarks, far upriver. The French people were somewhat more cynical, even back then. They did not believe the advertisement. So the French government increased the recruitment pressure by turning to the 3 Ps. The poor, the prisoners, and the professional women. We have children on the boat, we're going to keep that part clean. Those professional women were given a choice. You can go to jail, or you can marry a prisoner and go to New Orleans. The prisoners are given a similar choice. You can stay in jail, or you can marry a professional woman and go to New Orleans. Many, many people took this offer. They were quite literally married in chains, sight unseen, and then sent to New Orleans to begin their new lives as newlyweds. So as you can see, New Orleans has been a honeymoon destination right from the very beginning. Now even this was not enough. The French government turned to outright kidnapping. About 5,000 poor people disappeared off the streets of Paris over the next few years. They were simply picked up, put on ships, and then sent to New Orleans. Now these were not slaves, because they could do anything they wanted once they got here. They were just required to be here. Now this did succeed in filling the colony with colonists, but not surprisingly, this did not fill the colonists with a large sense of duty, patriotism, or a particularly strong work ethic. The reputation for New Orleans as a somewhat wild and hedonistic port city began early on. Which is perhaps why the next group of people came. In 1727, the Ursuline nuns came to New Orleans to start a convent and bring a much-needed dose of education, moderation, and religion to the city. They built what is now the oldest standing structure in the city of New Orleans. The Ursuline convent in the French Quarter is still there. It is quite lovely, and if you are so inclined, you may walk over and take a look at it. It's now a museum. The second oldest building in the city is a bar. And it definitely says something about our culture here in New Orleans that the oldest building is a Catholic convent, while the second oldest is a bar that was once owned by a pirate. And it definitely says something more about our culture here in New Orleans, and perhaps our culture here in America, that there is no truth to that statement whatsoever. It does make a great story, and I do understand that. And that story gets repeated everywhere. It's a wonderful marketing tool. But there are several distinct problems with calling Lafitte's blacksmith shop the second oldest building in the city. Number one, it is absolutely, definitely not the second oldest building in the city. Number two, the bar was first opened in the 1970s. Three, the building was never owned by Lafitte and has no verifiable connection to him whatsoever. And four, judging from a lack of iron in the ground itself, it almost certainly was never at any point a blacksmith shop. Other than that, George sells a lot of beer. The next big cultural development actually happened in 1724 when they passed a law called the Code Noir, the Black Code. The Code Noir defined the rights and the privileges of the freedmen of color and of the slaves. The freedmen were given the right to own property and to own weapons. These are rights not granted elsewhere on the continent, and that led to a large and thriving freedmen population. About 1/3 of the city of New Orleans were freedmen of color by the end of the 1730s. The slaves were given the right to have one day off every week, as well as the right to assemble. Again, these are rights not granted elsewhere on the continent. And they exercised these rights, getting together at a place called Congo Square, which is now called Louis Armstrong Park, and there they would play African rhythms and European instruments. And that is the roots of jazz. Those are the oldest roots. And jazz, as an art form, would not have developed in the way that it did, or in the location that it did, if not for the law passed in 1724, granted the African slaves the right to get together and play music. Later to invent an entirely new type of music. But New Orleans was not a profitable colony until they found their commodity, a remnant of which still exists today. Directly in front of the boat, we'll pass by in a few minutes, there is a large smokestack. And there they still make a white powder that makes you hyper. It's kind of addictive, and it can be expensive. Sugar. Sugar was the real wealth of the Caribbean colonies. Before cotton was king, sugar was white gold. The process for making sugar was very dangerous and very labor-intensive at the time. It is what drove the slave trade to the Caribbean. You took sugarcane sap, you boiled it until there was nothing left. The result was a form of sugar. Sugarcane sap boils at a much, much higher temperature than water. And there were many, many men, women, and children who were scalded, disfigured, or killed by the molten sugarcane sap. It's extremely dangerous, but it was very, very profitable. By 1750, sugar is the most widely traded and valuable commodity in all of Europe. And that simple fact is what shaped and defined the next 60 years of New Orleans history. One way or another, it always came back to the sugar. but I'll have to cover that in a moment. All right, folks, off the port side of the boat, we're passing two very large Navy ships, the Cape Kennedy and the Cape Knox. They're part of the United States Navy's Rapid Deployment Fleet. And although I do have the utmost respect for the United States Navy, and even though it is no longer football season, I am still very happy about what happened in December. Because I have a microphone, and the Navy doesn't. Go Army, beat Navy. The ships are essentially giant floating parking garages kept in a perpetual state of readiness. They can be loaded up and on their way in just a few hours if given the orders to go. Their nickname Ro-Ros stands for roll on, roll off, because that is how they are loaded. As we pass the ships, you can see at the rear two very large structures. Those ramps are actually strong enough you could drive tanks across them. They're very sturdy structures. All right, sugar. The sale of sugar makes the sugar barons obscenely wealthy. The taxes and tariffs on sugar fill the coffers of the kings. And the King of France is very jealous and protective of his sugar taxes, sugar tariffs, and sugar profits. The King of France had a serious problem. By the 1760s, he's losing a war with the British. The Americans call this the French and Indian War. The British call it the 7 Years' War. It's the same war. King of France knows he will be defeated, and as part of the surrender, he'll be forced to give up all of the French lands in the New World. To prevent the British from getting their hands on Louisiana and New Orleans, and the resulting sugar taxes, tariffs, and profits, the King of France gives them away. He surrenders to the Spanish in 1763. Spain takes control of Louisiana and New Orleans. Only after this transfer is complete does France surrender to the British, and the British take what's left. And what's left was Canada. And that is how the French colony of Canada became part of the British Empire, now the British Commonwealth, but they don't get Louisiana and they don't get New Orleans. So New Orleans becomes a Spanish city in 1763. No one tells New Orleans. For 2 years we were Spanish and we didn't know it. Don't you hate it when that happens? When the Spanish government finally showed up, the New Orleanians reacted rather apathetically. They refused to invite the Spanish governor to their parties. And they wrote letters to the King of France telling him how much we loved him, how much we missed him, and begging him to please, please take us back. It did not work. That sort of thing never does. There was a very minor attempt at a rebellion in 1768, wherein a few men knocked on the door of the Spanish governor's house, and they asked him to leave. And he did. But he went to Cuba, he came back with a few more soldiers, he shot the two men that had knocked on his door, and that was the end of the rebellion. It was rather half-hearted. New Orleans was actually a Spanish city for 40 years, which is almost exactly the same amount of time that it was French. But the culture in New Orleans remained almost completely French. Spanish culture actually had very little lasting impact on New Orleans culture, not in language, cuisine, customs, costumes, or holidays. The reason for this is because of women. That's right, women. The Spanish government did not allow Spanish women to come to New Orleans at all. None. There were no single Spanish women. There were no married Spanish women. There were no Spanish families, which meant that there were no Spanish daughters growing up in the city. They would only send young single Spanish men. And really not that many of those, because this was not exactly a hotbed of rebellious activity. When those Spanish men got to New Orleans, they learned how to speak French very quickly so they could do their jobs, and so they could speak to the locals, and of course speak to the local French women. When they got married, they married the local French women, who cooked French food, spoke French to their children, and celebrated holidays in a French fashion here in the city of New Orleans. For this reason, even through 40 years of Spanish rule, the culture remained almost completely French. Except in one very specific area, and that is architecture. The French Quarter is called the French Quarter because the French people founded it. The French people lived there. They laid down the streets and they gave them French names. But the buildings in the French Quarter are not French. The buildings are Spanish. This is because the French had insisted on building their buildings out of wood, sometimes literally just driftwood. This had a tendency to burn down and take large parts of the city with it. After one particularly bad fire, the Spanish government in New Orleans said, no mas. If you're going to build in the French Quarter, you're going to have to use non-flammable material. The Spanish government in New Orleans essentially imported the building codes, the building styles, the building designs, the building materials, and the builders themselves directly from Castilian Spain. Over the course of the next 4 decades, especially towards the end, they rebuilt the French Quarter into what it is today. The clay-tiled roofs, the stucco walls, all of that beautiful wrought iron ornamentation. These are all elements of Spanish architecture, not French. So things continue on this way in New Orleans for several decades, until the little Corsican rises to power. Napoleon Bonaparte seizes control of France. Since you're being such a wonderfully attentive audience, I do appreciate that, sincerely, I'm going to take the time to explain something that I sometimes skip, and that is this. Believe it or not, I just told all of you a lie. I did. I called Napoleon the little Corsican. Napoleon was from Corsica. Napoleon was Corsican. Napoleon was not little. That's a lie. It is quite literally a British lie. No offense, guys. And here's where it comes from. Before Napoleon instituted the metric system, the French and the British used two different systems of measurement with the same terminology. Under the French measuring system, Napoleon was 5 feet 2 inches tall. Under the British measuring system, the one we're more familiar with today, the one we still use here in America, he was 5'7", actually slightly under 5'7". The average height for a Frenchman at the time was approximately 5'6". Napoleon Bonaparte was just about 1 inch taller than average height. The British were aware of this, or at least some of them were, and they ignored it. The 5'2" number was repeated in all of the books, the correspondence, in newspaper articles, in speeches, in Parliament, everywhere. It is not true. It is based on a miscalculation, a misconversion between two distinctly different systems of measurement. If you're curious about the details, they're all online. But it is essentially British propaganda that has been propagated for the last 200 years. So, not abnormally small, but definitely extremely ambitious. Napoleon had dreams of a sugar empire funding his wars in Europe. To accomplish this, he needed two pieces. He needed Haiti, which was the largest sugar producer, and he needed New Orleans, the biggest city in this part of the world. Now, at that point, Napoleon has Haiti, and he wants New Orleans back. In order to get it back, Napoleon goes to the King of Spain, and he says, "Give it back." And they do. Now, officially, they traded it for a very small piece of Italy, but in reality, it's a shakedown. But before his sugar empire could get up and running, there was a slave revolt in Haiti. The Haitian slaves, tired of being scalded, disfigured, and killed by the molten sugarcane sap for the profit of the sugar barons across the ocean, revolt. Napoleon sent an army to retake the colony. The army failed. Haiti remained free. And here's the key. Without Haiti as the sugar producer, there can be no sugar empire. Without a sugar empire, Napoleon doesn't want New Orleans. It's a waste of military resources to defend it, and he will get nothing from it. So instead of trying to keep it, he gets rid of it by selling it to the Americans for $15 million. Cover that in a moment. All right, folks, off the port side of the boat, that series of beautiful buildings is not a hotel or a resort. That is a military base. Jackson Barracks, headquarters of the Louisiana National Guard. To my mind, to my eye, I think that is probably one of the more beautiful military bases that we have. Perhaps the second most beautiful. The first, of course, being West Point. But that is just my admittedly biased opinion. Yours may differ. $15 million works out to 3 cents an acre, the largest land deal in all of human history. Because when I say Louisiana, I do not mean the state. I mean, of course, the watershed. Everything that the Mississippi River drains that is west of the Mississippi River itself. That's the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon takes the money, he outfits more than one army, and then he attacks everyone. The French, the British, and their allies begin fighting all over the planet. It is the first truly global conflict. And the Americans, we stayed out of it. At that point in our history, we had very little strength to speak of. We did not get involved in a clash between the two greatest powers on Earth. Instead, we stayed neutral, and we were trading with both sides. Which is somewhat duplicitous, but that's what we did. But while we were staying neutral, we were building ships. Lots and lots of ships. In the first decade of the 19th century, America expands the U.S. Navy, the U.S. merchant fleets, and the U.S. whaling fleets so quickly. We built so many ships in such a short period of time that America, as a country, literally starts running out of sailors. We have so many new ships, we do not have enough men to man the boats. Which is actually a real problem. To fix this problem, we turn to the best sailors in the world, the British. British sailors were offered higher wages, better living conditions, a more lenient punishment schedule, more rum, American citizenship, and of course the extra added ancillary benefit of not being at war with Napoleon. Many, many British sailors take this offer. They jump ship, become American citizens and American sailors. The British are aware that this is happening. It made them very angry, and they start taking them back by force. British ships started stopping American ships on the high seas, boarding them, and forcing sailors off at gunpoint. Telling them, you are now part of His Majesty's Royal Navy, get to work. And that is the biggest single issue that leads to war. The other issue that leads to war is Canada. But I'll cover that in just one moment. All right, very briefly, off the port side of the boat, we're passing the Domino Sugar Refinery. Believe it or not, that is one of the largest sugar refineries in the world. 1 million tons a year, 7.2 million pounds a day. Yes, I really do mean that. Yes, all of it. Yes, still. Yes, even those buildings. The answer to your next question is, they don't care. It is Sunday, so they're not doing it at the moment, but tomorrow they will be refining huge amounts of sugar. All right, the other issue that leads to war is Canada. Now, if you are an American riding this boat, you may want to pay attention to this next part of the story, because it is taught in every single Canadian school. It is not taught in American schools, but it absolutely did happen. The United States declares war on the British in 1812. That is why it's called the War of 1812. And if you're from America, I realize that you don't know anything about the War of 1812. And here's why. After we declared war, the very first thing that America did was invade Canada. Thomas Jefferson had years earlier said we could do this as a mere matter of marching. We could walk up into Canada, take over the entire country without even firing a shot. The Canadians would surrender, become part of the United States, we'd be one big happy family. It did not work out that way. The U.S. invades Canada in 1812, and we were defeated in almost every single battle. We were not defeated by the British Army, because they didn't send anyone to help. We were not defeated by the Canadian Army, because that did not exist. No. The American Army, now the most powerful the world has ever known, was defeated by the citizen militias of Canada. And their allies, the First Peoples, the Native Canadians, especially the Iroquois Confederation. They took their own muskets and they pushed the United States back into the United States. Now, because they were Canadian, I'm sure that they apologized while they were doing it, but they definitely did it. In fact, they did it 3 times. The U.S. invades Canada in 1812, again in 1813, and again in 1814. We are defeated, we retreated 3 times. The war did not go well. The only bit of success that we had is we were able to occupy a city called York for approximately 1 week. But when the Canadians arrived, they forced us out. And on our way out of the city, we burned it, which now would be considered a war crime, but that's what we did. And the British got revenge for that one, because by 1814 they had finally dealt with Napoleon, and they put him on an island where he could never bother anybody ever again. Or so they thought. They were wrong. The British then send a massive fleet across the Atlantic Ocean. The very first thing that they do when they get here is invade Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground. This was revenge for the Americans burning York. York is still there, by the way. It is now called Toronto. After the British burned D.C., they go up the river to Baltimore, and they tried to do the same thing there, but we stopped them before they could, at a place called Fort McHenry. We know they couldn't get past the fort because they couldn't take the fort. We know they couldn't take the fort because they couldn't take the flag. I know that, and if you're an American, you know that, even though you might not know it. By the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Francis Scott Key wrote those words while being detained on a British ship watching them attack Fort McHenry trying to get to Baltimore, 1814. It is now the American national anthem. You know the national anthem. That's the song that they played a few months ago at the Olympics, when our girls beat the Canadian girls to take the gold medal in hockey. After the British failed to burn Baltimore, they headed south towards New Orleans. 10,000 troops in 42 ships. To defend New Orleans, Andrew Jackson had 1,000 American soldiers. Outnumbered 10 to 1, with not enough men or muskets to defend the city. How Andrew Jackson manages to do this, who helps him, and what happened is why we are here. Because we are here. Off the port side of the boat, that is the Chalmette battlefield. That is where the Battle of New Orleans was fought. That is where we are going to disembark. You don't have to go if you don't want to. The boat will be open, the music will be playing, the bar will be serving, the food will be out. But you're here, so you might as well. It's also a pretty nice day for it. There will be a park ranger down there to give a description of the Battle of New Orleans itself. He will talk for most of the time you are down there. And if you do not want to listen, you do not have to. There is a museum. It is free. It is videos, artifacts, a few things for the kids to pick up. It is the white building with the cars in front of it. If you are not a native English speaker, or someone in your group is not, we respectfully suggest that the museum will be easier to understand than the Ranger's lecture. To put it in another way, ahí está el museo y las Casa Blanca, I think. So le musée is la Maison Blanche, museo es la Casa Bianca, das Museum es das Weiße Haus, and du Paruski, comrade? Museo at the Belly Dome. As we exit, you will hear a song called The Battle of New Orleans. First sung in 1959, the song is actually about the Battle of New Orleans. And if you have never heard this song before, well, this will be your first time. And one last final thought, the captain is going to get on the mic and give some instructions on how to get off the boat, where to get off the boat, but much, much more important, folks, when to get back on the boat so that you do not get left here at the battlefield. It has happened before. It will happen again. If it happens today, I assure you that I will cheerfully and shamelessly wave at you as the boat goes by. Don't let that happen to you. Get back here on time. And thank you all very much for listening so very well.
Thank you, Charlie. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome you to the Chalmette Battlefield. There's a couple points we need to make about your visit. We ask that you please keep your activities restricted to the left-hand side of the park, facing the park from this perspective. On the park grounds is a very inviting roadway which leads off to the right. This roadway will lead you to the Chalmette National Cemetery. The cemetery is not part of this tour. You will not have enough time to walk down there and back to the boat before the boat leaves the dock, so please keep your activities restricted to the left-hand side of the park, facing the park. The clock on the pilot house wall says it's 10:34 a.m. Creole Queen's leaving the dock, heading back to the city today at exactly 11:30. When it's time for you to return to the vessel, you're going to hear a departing whistle signal. One long blast followed by two short blasts at exactly 11:25, or when it is time to leave. If you're standing in the park's visitor center at this time, you may not hear the departing whistle signal, so please pay close attention to the time. One of our deck crew members will be out in the park to round you up and remind you it's time to return to the vessel. You're more than welcome to remain on board. Once the deck crew has safely secured our lines, our gangway is going out all the way forward, all the way down, left side of the vessel. We ask that you please use the handrails while going up or down the steps and while disembarking the vessel at the gangway. Also keep in mind that the thresholds do come up about 6 inches at the doorway, so please watch your step. There's no food or beverages allowed in the park's visitor center. No alcoholic beverages allowed on the park's grounds. Many trash receptacles located throughout the park and throughout the vessel, so please put your trash in its proper location. If any one of you decide not to return back to the city aboard the Creole Queen, we ask that you please be courteous enough to let the park visitor center